Of the many horror games I have played so far, few managed to achieve the status of being a beloved masterpiece like Silent Hill 2. The second main entry in the long-running franchise made its legacy well known after debuting in 2001 for the PlayStation 2. The game has been regarded as one of the best horror games ever made, with a fantastic story with hard-hitting themes, characters that add a lot of mystery and depth, and of course being the next big step from the first game on the PlayStation 1. And to do so, we must look at the game that made survival horror very popular in the late 90s.
Resident Evil.
With Resident Evil debuting in 1996, many companies at the time wanted to ride that survival horror train. Thus, many games were made to compete with what RE brought to the table. While not being the first to birth the survival horror genre in gaming, that honor goes to Alone in the Dark, it did make its mark well known in its own right. And later in 1999, publisher Konami released their own game that was originally meant to be its own knockoff of RE, but little did they know that the game would turn out to be a huge mega hit, and that game is Silent Hill. The whole premise involves the main protagonist Harry Mason on the search for his missing daughter after surviving a car crash near the town of Silent Hill, a resort town that went to hell thanks to a cult called the Order, whose main goal is to bring back their god to unleash an apocalypse and in the process bring humanity's destruction. The location itself became iconic to those who played it, with the whole town being surrounded in fog and creatures that you have to face from your worst nightmare as you journey your way through the town, not just to save Harry's daughter, but to also prevent the Order from ending the world. With how successful it was inevitable that a sequel was in the works, and worked on by the same team that brought the first game to life, Team Silent. However, this would take the series in a different direction than the first, and as a result, spawned the game that I'll be talking about, Silent Hill 2. Now, considering how old Silent Hill 2 is, this video will have spoilers being discussed for this analysis, especially for much later on in the finale, so you have been warned. But for everyone else who has played Silent Hill 2, or surprisingly doesn't care for spoilers, then join me through the fog as I discuss Silent Hill 2. Once you boot up the game, a cutscene will play of a man staring in a mirror in a dirty restroom that has seen better days. Taking in a deep breath, he then speaks his first words for the first time. This sets the story in motion greatly, as you're given a quick mystery of the so-called Mary being in a town. You get to take control for the first time once the cutscene is over, and as soon as you leave, the whole plot slowly unravels to you with narration from both Mary and from the main protagonist himself, James Sunderland, after he receives a letter from Mary proclaiming that she is in the town in a special place waiting for him.
In my restless dreams, I see that town. Silent Hill. You promised you'd take me there again someday, but you never did. Well, I'm alone there now, in our special place, waiting for you.
I got a letter. The name on the envelope said Mary.
Personally, it's a pretty fantastic way to start off the game, with bits and pieces slowly being given to you about James's wife. Although the big kicker for the story is, she's dead. The only explanation we do get from this intro is the fact that Mary did die from being sick a long time ago, Thus, the story begins with James Sunderland getting the letter from Mary as he drives his way to the town of Silent Hill in hopes of seeing her again. This is because before Silent Hill became what it is thanks to the Order, James and Mary used to stop over there when it was normal, when it was a peaceful resort town, as this adds a perfect hook to the story as you go out of your way to find Mary throughout the plot, and as the player, discover what went down between the two as you uncover James Sunderland's past. As you start progressing for the first time, you do traverse your way through a forest enveloped by fog, while sounds from the environment work to slowly creep their way into your mind. It's only until you get to the cemetery in which you encounter a strange young woman called Angela for the first time.
Excuse me,
Oh, I'm sorry. I
No,
was
it's
just...
okay. I didn't mean to scare you. I'm kind of lost.
Lost?
She is also looking for someone, almost like if the town called to her like with James, but for very different reasons. As she claims to be looking for her mother, or as she strangely says, her mama.
I'm looking for my mama. I mean my mother. It's been so long since I've seen her.
We also learn through this dialogue that she's also looking for her father and brother who are also possibly in this town. While you talk to Angela, you get the impression that something about her isn't right. The way she acts and talks leads the player to think something is strange, but we will get to see that in depth much later. As the cutscene draws close to the end, she even warns James not to go.
It's kind of hard to explain, but
Is it dangerous?
maybe. And it's not just the fog either.
Okay,
It's...
I got it. I'll be careful.
I'm not lying.
No, I believe you. It's just... I guess I really don't care if it's dangerous or not.
James does get his directions in the end towards Silent Hill, but when he gets there, something in the fog moves. And as time goes on, you follow these blood trails that are on the road, and later on, you soon find the radio and that strange monster that you saw in the fog, being wrapped in like a tightened cocoon, almost like the thing is crying out in pain to be freed as you get your first melee weapon to begin your first combat sequence. Once your first combat sequence is over, the radio will suddenly come back on as James wonders who it is on the other side. And with little time to waste, you must progress your way through Silent Hill and its many strange horrors in hopes of finding Mary. Now, for a game that came out in 2001, I think the overall look and presentation for Silent Hill 2 still holds up really well. The whole world and atmosphere works wonders in creeping into your mind as you traverse your way through the town, especially with how the fog is incorporated into the setting. When you're outside, the fog does a fantastic job in hindering your vision to set the mood as you have little to no idea what would come out, with sound cues that pop up every now and again as you prepare yourself for what monsters will attack you. Now, all of this may sound bad on paper at first, but thankfully you do have a map that you can use that you can easily find within James' car, so therefore you're not going to get lost too much when you're out and about. Another point of discussion is that the controls, I think for the most part, are good since you have two options for how you want to play, with 2D and 3D control options available in the menu. Now, 3D starts you off with tank controls, like with similar games of this control scheme, like the early Resident Evil games for example. 2D, however, will make controlling James more directional in a way that with no tank controls, it might be easy as pressing a button for which way to go without having to steer James around. Before getting deep into the game, I would personally say switch between the two and decide which option suits you the most, but from my experience, I personally don't mind tank controls, as I feel that's how the game is meant to be played, but I guess that's a personal thing as your experience may differ. Combat may not be the best at first glance, with how awkward it is to aim your swings and to move around targets. Until the more I got used to it, I did understand the way it's implemented. You see, using weapons is as simple as holding a button to arm yourself and pressing the other to make your attacks. You swing a melee weapon or aim your gun to fire, and considering how you're not playing a badass killing machine with other games out there, it makes sense why James would act this way in defending himself, since he's just a normal everyday guy. I mean, come on. He's not in the best shape out there compared to other characters, so when push comes to shove, maybe take your time in how you deal with certain situations in combat. Speaking of combat, the enemies you face in Silent Hill 2 design-wise are absolutely creepy. I mean, one of the more common enemies, as I discussed before, which is called the Lying Figure, seems to be entangled in this strong cocoon, almost like they're reeling and screaming in pain, and the body movements they make, whether they're standing or they're fastly crawling on the ground, just really do a fantastic job of creeping you out. And of course there are other enemies you will come across, like some creepy mannequins and some nurses. Those goddamn creepy nurses, you can't forget about them. But of course, Silent Hill 2 was also the one that introduced probably its most iconic monster to the franchise, Pyramid Head. Now, you will encounter this monster very early on in the apartment block, but sometimes when you walk into certain rooms, you encounter him doing some stuff that you probably wish you didn't see. Especially with what he does to one of the other monsters in the last part, which of course leads into a bit of a boss fight with him. And unfortunately, this is one of the big issues that I do have with Silent Hill 2. The boss battles are not great. I mean, for this one right here that you're seeing, you might think that you might have to strike some hits just to progress on the level, but I actually realized that some bosses are literally on a death timer. So all you have to do just to conserve your ammo and to, not get hit, is to just run around the bosses until the phases are over. Like for this fight here, when you hear a siren, that's Pyramid Head's cue to leave. And once that's over, well, you're just kind of left wondering, okay, is that the rest of the boss fight? And while these boss fights with these particular monsters may not be great, you can't help but deny that design-wise, they are absolutely fantastic in their appearance, and especially with how they serve a much greater purpose to the plot. And as you discover how, and through the symbolism, well, let's just say I'll save that for later when we discuss spoilers, because, well, once it all comes together, it kind of makes you appreciate the ideas and concepts of Silent Hill 2 a lot more better personally. What I love about the puzzles is that when you choose your difficulty option when starting the game, you can even choose how hard or easy the puzzles are compared to your normal standard difficulty for dealing with enemies in combat, for example. This results in you either having a really fun breeze, or if you wanted to, be given a much more challenging experience, like having more items to find or having to solve harder versions of puzzles you may have done on an easier difficulty. For example, there is this one puzzle early on that gives you this simple riddle, but if you play it on a harder difficulty, the riddle in question becomes more cryptic, more hard to put together, and thus if you are a fan of this kind of stuff, I feel like you're going to have a blast playing this game on a harder difficulty regarding the puzzles. This is something that I really love, and I do hope more horror games have these kinds of options before starting the game, as you're really making your own rules in a way before going out to solve them in the meantime. As you progress on in the game, you do come across more characters in the plot who have their own purpose and reason for being in Silent Hill. There's Eddie, who gets quite the introduction after you find him vomiting down a toilet while proclaiming that he didn't kill anyone. He does appear normal at first as your normal everyday fat guy, but as the story goes on and you learn about his past, he does begin to show some cracks of insanity.
Oh yeah? Why not? Till now I always let people walk all over me. Just like that stupid dog. He had it coming too!
Eddie?
I was just joking, James.
You also find a little girl called Laura whose introduction with James is pretty rough to say the least, considering how the first time you see her, well, she literally stomps on James's hand before he gets a chance to grab a key on the other side. So the fact that later on that these two don't see eye to eye on some things really says a lot about them. However, as the game progresses onwards and you have moments where you interact with her, you do get to understand her backstory and why she's in this town of Silent Hill, proclaiming to be a friend of James's wife, Mary. However, there are just some things that just don't add up, which causes James at one point to call her out on it.
You liar! Laura,
Fine, don't believe me.
But last year, Mary was already...
Overall, I do think Laura is a pretty solid character throughout and adds an intriguing mystery as to why she's here in this town. And of course, there's Maria, a strange woman who almost reminds James of his wife in appearance, with a few things different.
I can't believe it. You could be her twin. Your face, your voice, just your hair and clothes are different.
My name is Maria.
After that introduction, she will accompany you on your journey for a bit up until you get to the hospital in which she has to lay down and rest. However, you do discover her again in a bit of an odd manner outside of the hospital room, lashing out at James, almost like she's reenacting something from James's past, to put it lightly. Most of these characters overall have their own intrigue and mystery to them, almost like they're normal everyday people, but the more you learn about them and how shockingly broken they can be, it adds a lot more terror and despair to the overall experience. Now, this is where a lot of the major spoilers are going to be discussed throughout the last few acts of the game, so if you don't want to be spoiled for a game that is very old, then please feel free to click ahead to this timestamp. For everyone else, let's begin. Once you arrive at the hospital level section of the game, this is where a lot of crucial story moments kick in, and especially for much later on for the underground prison and the finale, which is at the hotel. Now, in the hospital level at the end, when you and Marie are slowly making your way out, a pyramid head comes out of nowhere and chases you in a very tight hallway, which does add a lot of tension and fear. But unfortunately, Maria bites the bullet and gets killed by Pyramid Head. However, keep in mind though, as you're about to see later, Maria does show up, even though, as you saw, she got killed. And the reasons for why she keeps coming back even though she dies multiple times, well, it serves to add a much more grander plot for the finale for the final boss, as you're probably going to see why later. Now, of course, for the underground prison level, this is where both Eddie and Angela get seen again, but for Eddie though, he has kinda lost the plot, as you discover him later on holding a revolver, almost like he just shot someone with it on a table. And as you progress on through the level and so on, Eddie then loses it and you two are engaged in a boss battle. Now, for this particular boss battle, Eddie's secret revelations are revealed because of the fact that he was on the run after being made fun of, so he kind of took some retribution by killing the people who dared to make fun of him. And through his own insanity, he kind of used James for doing the same thing once questioned. And of course, the boss fight kicks in. However, before Eddie kicks the bucket, he does, in his final moments before death, say that James is just like the rest of them, how he too was also called to the town of Silent Hill, like with Eddie. So basically, Eddie is what happens when you fail your test within Silent Hill, and thus Eddie here pays that price through death at the hands of James Sunderland, as he contemplates if Mary really is dead 3 years ago before the events of this game kick in. However, before leaving the prison and even before the Eddie boss fight, there is another that you get entangled with, but this time Angela makes another appearance, screaming in pain from a monster that is near her. And like with Pyramid Head, you are forced to engage with this monstrosity that looks like a table with legs and a face on top, well, to me at least, until finally, when you deal enough damage, Angela lashes out towards this figure as she reveals her very, very dark past. Because, well, unfortunately, Angela was, to put it lightly, not treated well by her father and brother. And if you're wondering what her father and brother did, well, I would have to go into some really, really dark territory, which I'm pretty sure some of you who have played Silent Hill 2 can easily put together. Now, when it comes to leaving the prison level, you then find yourself a boat, which you can row all across the lake to the hotel. And unfortunately, another issue that I do have is that the boat level, for me personally, kinda sucks. Like, you are thrown in the middle of nowhere, and you have to, like, guide yourself across in hopes of finding that blinking light almost like it's giving you a direction to your final destination, because for a long while, depending on where you are, you will likely get lost, and occasionally it will look like you might bump into some invisible walls telling you, hey, you're not supposed to be going that way. Once you finally get off the boat and you get to the hotel and solve more puzzles and dealing with more questionable monstrous figures again, you then get faced with some shocking revelations, because once you find a certain videotape and go to the room that you and Mary spent a lot of time with in Silent Hill, and you play the said tape, a huge shock twist is revealed. As the footage goes on, it looks like James Sunderland is holding the camera from his end while Mary talks to him, and as the footage breaks up, it shows Mary being in a bed like she's suffering from her disease, and at that point, in the final moments, James Sunderland walks towards her, waits for a few moments, and then gives her a mercy killing by smothering her to death with a pillow. And thus, everything comes in full circle as to why you're here in Silent Hill. After that truth is revealed and he remembers everything, James, depressed at his own discovery, sits down, head down, all in complete despair, for a memory he tried to block out so many years ago, and why that he is here in Silent Hill has now come in full circle. And especially when you consider that a lot of the enemies you have been facing early on are meant to symbolize many things from that dark era in James's life. For example, the lying figures are meant to represent a patient suffering in pain, just like Mary. And once you've solved all the symbolism for every other monster that you've faced throughout your entire journey, the figure that has been chasing you every now and again, Pyramid Head, also makes sense. Because after killing Mary, James, in his own way, created his own personal tormentor as to quote-unquote punish him for his sins. And thus it makes the connection between James and Pyramid Head all the more dark, to put it lightly. However, things do take an interesting turn when Mary tries to communicate with you again through the radio, and as you make your way through the hotel in hopes of finding her, you notice that the environment has changed. The hotel is decayed. Drips of water are everywhere. Hell, even the basement area is even flooded. All of that is meant to symbolize James' mental state after discovering the revelation that he hid a suppressed memory of being the one that actually killed his wife. Along with that, you even find Angela for the last time as she's about to ascend some stairs, while her mental state is shown to be nothing but fire and destruction. And no matter how hard James tries, she walks up the stairs. The fire grows stronger, you can't go up to save her, and her fate is left to a complete mystery. Whether she died, overcome her eternal struggles, or somewhere in between. For me, this is definitely one of the more saddest moments of the game for me, that shows that unfortunately, no matter how hard you try, some people just cannot recover from the trauma that they've been inflicted in life. And that just gives a very hard reality for some people. As you make your progressions throughout the hotel after that shocking revelation, James comes across Maria again, being held captive by more than one Pyramid Head this time, as she gets killed off for the third time. Now, Maria is meant to be this illusion, this fantasy view of what James wants Mary to be, which makes the more sense considering what he said early on in their first encounter. And after standing up to your guilt and the Pyramid Heads killing themselves literally, you get to the final boss. For this particular final boss, depending on which of the endings that you get, you will face Maria for the most part, with the only difference with one of them being Mary being actually there. So I think now is the time for me to analyze the three main endings that you can achieve on your first playthrough. Now, for the first ending, you can achieve what many people would get for their common ending, the Leave ending. Now, Leave sounds pretty self-explanatory, with James escaping from Silent Hill and fulfilling Mary's final wish of adopting a child. Now, in the scene beforehand in the credits, you can see James just sitting next to a sickened Mary as they share their final words, and Mary giving him a letter. Throughout all of the main endings, you get to read and discover the full context of Mary's letter that you've heard from the very beginning. Now, the letter itself, as I won't spoil much of it, is probably one of the most saddest moments of Silent Hill 2 I've experienced. Probably one of the most saddest moments in any dark video game that I've played. Now, to achieve the leave ending, you simply play how you would normally do in any survival horror game, making sure your health is in top condition, making sure you don't inspect certain items, and of course hearing out Mary's final words in the hallway, which through the dialogue that is exchanged with Mary in the past, reveals that the relationship between James and Mary was very rocky when she was sick, lashing out towards him and begging him to stay in the end, before going ahead and fighting Maria in the final boss. Now, this one to me seems to be my personal favorite ending because of the fact that logically I feel like it would make sense for James to come to his own revelations and to take responsibility for what he did. And thus, fulfilling Mary's final wish of adopting Laura, I think just puts a nice little bow on top. Now, the second ending, Maria, is where James basically learns nothing. He gives into his fantasy of being with Maria, wants to be with her, and wants to protect her. So, to achieve this ending, you would do exactly that. You spend a lot of time with her, you protect her from the monsters that want to harm her, and before you head to the final boss, you don't listen to Mary's final conflicts in the hallway, and thus Mary will be there as the actual final boss, as James and Maria leave Silent Hill together. Now, I can see James being in a sort of state of mind where he would want to be with someone who he would consider to be the perfect Mary. However, in the final few moments before the ending fully closes, Maria coughs, almost like it's trying to tell us that unfortunately, not only has James failed his own test, but he's doomed to repeat history again. The final ending that you can get is in the water, or simply in water. Now, out of all the endings I've discussed, this one is the most depressing, the most heartbreaking, because this is the ending to me where James Sunderland gives up on life. He can't live on without Mary, and thus, in their final moments together, he takes her out of the bed, puts her in the car, says his final words, and as the car revs up, drives into the water. And again, how you achieve this said ending is that you have to make sure your health is low throughout your playthrough, which is going to be quite a challenge if you want to achieve a very depressing ending, and you have to analyze certain items you find, such as a photo of Mary, the letter, and a knife that you find from Angela, who was contemplating doing some self-deletion, to put it lightly. Now, the way you earn all these three endings I discussed are pretty unique in the terms of Silent Hill 2. Unlike other games where you have to make moral choices through actions or dialogue, Silent Hill 2 lets you dictate the endings you get through gameplay, through steps and methods that may seem not much at first, but when you put two and two together, you just go, oh, that is actually really cool. And thus, I really like how you could achieve these set endings. Now, depending on which version of Silent Hill 2 you get, 3 more endings can be unlocked, but for the sake of the video, I don't think it's that majorly important to talk about the bonus endings that you could achieve, as I do feel like they should be something you should experience yourself. Now, with all that being said and done, there are many different versions of Silent Hill 2 out there, and the big question that some of you may be asking is, which version do I play? Well, it's very obvious, well, for me at least. If you do have a PlayStation 2 lying around, I would strongly encourage you to play the original versions, as most fans say that the original versions of Silent Hill 2 are the best way to experience this classic. Now, the PC version is pretty much rough around the edges, with it not being a great port, but if you do take the measures in installing fan patches like I did, then you can pretty much get yourself a Silent Hill 2 experience to be absolutely fantastic. And unfortunately, there's the last version out there, the HD collection for the PS3 and Xbox 360 that bundles both Silent Hill 2 and Silent Hill 3. Now, the HD collection is probably the worst way that you can experience this game because of the fact that, well, to put it bluntly, it's a broken, glitchy mess. Now, I could go on and on for my experience for why it is terrible, for what went on in-game and behind the scenes, but instead, I'm going to link some videos in the description from the channel Twin Perfect that I saw years ago that go into absolutely fantastic detail for what went wrong with the HD collection. And for some reason in the HD collection they changed the font of the town sign to Comic Sans. Who does that? Overall, in the end, Silent Hill 2 is a very special horror game for me. It has a pretty fantastic story, a strong set of characters, and the tone of the horror that it goes for gets absolutely nailed to a T. And another thing I forgot to mention as well is that how amazing the soundtrack is from series composer Akira Yamaoka, which really enhances the overall experience. Like, if you get the chance after this video, I would encourage you to have a listen to some of the game's tracks, as I do think they do an overall fantastic job. Now, again, as I previously mentioned earlier, if you can find an original copy of the PlayStation 2 version or mod the PC version, either way, you're going to have a fantastic time. And that is why Silent Hill 2 gets a strong recommendation.